Julia Petrova had always believed that life could be predictable, even if just for a while. After years of working in the high-paced world of marketing in Moscow, where stress was a constant companion, she made the decision to start anew. She wanted peace. She dreamed of quiet mornings with no rush, evenings filled with the soft murmur of the city fading into the distance, and the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's name. So, she packed her bags, left behind the city lights, and moved to a small suburban house on the outskirts of the city, hoping to find that elusive serenity she longed for. Her new home was modest, but it was everything Julia needed. A small two-story house nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with a garden that stretched out in front, lined with mature trees that seemed to shield her from the outside world. The house wasn't perfect. There were the usual cracks in the walls, the creaky stairs, and the lingering smell of dust, but to Julia it felt like a blank canvas. She saw potential in every corner, a place where she could breathe freely and, perhaps for the first time, feel truly at home. It had been her grandmother's dream to live in a house like this, and now that dream had become hers. Julia spent the first few weeks in blissful solitude, setting up the house and trying to make it her own. She didn't mind the occasional visit from the neighbors. After all, she wasn't used to the isolation, and a little interaction here and there seemed harmless enough. The first person to welcome her was Karen Wilson, a stout woman in her mid-50s who lived in the house next door. Karen's appearance was nothing extraordinary. Short, graying hair, thick glasses, and a face that carried the weight of years of hard living. But there was something in her eyes, a sense of entitlement and judgment that Julia couldn't quite place. At first, Karen seemed friendly enough. She arrived one morning unannounced with a basket of homemade cookies, her smile wide and warm. They chatted about the neighborhood, about the quiet charm of the cul-de-sac, and about how long each of them had lived in the area. Julia was a little taken aback by the visit, but she wasn't one to judge. After all, Karen was just being neighborly, right? Or so it seemed. As the conversation progressed, Karen's eyes frequently wandered over to Julia's driveway where her car was parked. Julia didn't think much of it, but she noticed that Karen kept glancing at it, almost as if measuring the distance between her own property and Julia's. "I see you've got a nice car there, Julia," Karen remarked after a while, her tone casual, almost too casual. "It's just that this street can get a bit crowded sometimes. You know how it is when people start parking everywhere." Julia smiled politely, nodding in agreement. She had noticed that parking was tight on the street, but she had no intention of keeping her car anywhere other than her driveway. However, Karen seemed to insist, her voice now taking on a more pointed tone. "I don't mean to complain, but I've had a bit of trouble with people parking in front of my house. Not just you, of course, but others too. I'm sure you understand." It was the first time Julia felt a slight discomfort in the conversation, though she didn't want to overthink it. She assured Karen that she would be mindful of the parking situation in the future, though, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was trying to establish some sort of dominance over her, some unspoken rule that she wasn't quite privy to. In the days that followed, Karen's behavior became more intrusive. She would show up unannounced, sometimes at odd hours, to check in, offering unsolicited advice about the neighborhood, the local shops, and even how Julia should maintain her lawn. Julia, ever the professional, tried to keep things cordial, but she began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the constant attention. What began as casual conversation quickly morphed into passive-aggressive remarks and veiled criticisms. Karen seemed to take issue with everything Julia did, from how she trimmed her bushes to the way she decorated her porch. Nothing was ever quite good enough for Karen. But it wasn't just the small things that began to irk Julia. It was the growing sense of control that Karen seemed to wield. One evening, when Julia returned home from work, she found that her car had been moved. It was parked in a completely different spot on her driveway, as if someone had decided to fix the situation for her. Julia's first thought was that maybe her neighbor had borrowed her car, Or perhaps another neighbor had been dealing with a similar parking issue. But when she walked up to Karen's house to ask if she knew anything about it, she was met with a strange response. "Oh, I noticed your car was a little too close to my driveway, so I decided to move it for you," Karen said, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. Her smile was wide, almost too wide. There was no apology, no explanation, just a casual statement of fact. Julia stood there, momentarily speechless, trying to process what had just happened. Karen had moved her car, without asking, without permission. It was a small thing, a minor inconvenience, but something about it felt deeply wrong. This was the moment when Julia began to realize that Karen's behavior was not just harmless eccentricity, it was control, and that control was starting to extend beyond the driveway. The situation escalated slowly at first, with Karen's actions becoming bolder and more intrusive. She began knocking on Julia's door at random times, sometimes with trivial questions about the neighborhood, other times offering unsolicited help with gardening or house maintenance. Julia's polite refusals were met with thinly veiled resentment, and she began to feel more and more cornered by the woman next door. It was as if Karen had decided that she was going to be the center of Julia's life, whether Julia liked it or not. But it wasn't just the visits that were starting to get under Julia's skin. There was something about Karen's demeanor that made Julia uneasy, a quiet, persistent pressure to conform, to bend to her will. And it wasn't long before Karen's behavior started crossing the line into something more dangerous. Julia began receiving strange anonymous notes slipped under her door. They were cryptic, sometimes threatening, and always laced with an undertone of menace. "You're not welcome here," one of them read. "We'll take care of the problem," another said, written in hurried, jagged handwriting. Each note felt like a warning, a reminder that Karen was watching her, controlling her world, and Julia had no idea how far this woman would go. As the days went by, the situation became unbearable. Julia tried to ignore the notes, tried to move past Karen's interference, but it was clear that the woman wasn't going to stop. Julia had no choice but to confront the problem head-on. The quiet peace she had hoped for in this suburban neighborhood was slipping away, replaced by fear and unease. And it was only going to get worse from here. The peaceful life she had envisioned, full of quiet evenings and simple joys, had turned into a battleground where every step felt like a calculated risk. Julia was no longer just a neighbor to Karen. She was a target. And the more she tried to assert herself, the more Karen seemed determined to push her into submission. As Julia sat alone in her living room one evening, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this woman destroy the life she had worked so hard to build. But what could she do? How far was she willing to go to stop Karen? And how much damage would she have to endure before she could finally break free? The answer would come sooner than she expected. The first act of true violence would happen that very night, and it would mark the beginning of a fight for her freedom that Julia couldn't have predicted. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, and Julia felt the unease she had been suppressing for weeks creep up on her. It wasn't just the constant tension in the air, nor the overbearing presence of her neighbor, Karen, but something else, a feeling deep in her gut that something was going terribly wrong. The house, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a prison, and she was trapped inside, unable to escape the relentless pressure. She had tried to reason with Karen, but every time she thought things might settle down, Karen's strange behavior would resurface, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. The notes, the interference, the subtle yet undeniable power plays, all of it had started to wear her down. Julia had thought about confronting Karen directly, but there was always this nagging doubt in her mind. What if Karen's behavior wasn't just eccentricity? What if it was something worse? And the truth was, Julia didn't have the answers. Her days had become a blur of mundane tasks, errands, and endless phone calls that served as little more than distractions from the real problem. Each time Julia tried to go about her life, it felt like someone, was watching her, waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake. And that someone was Karen. Karen, who seemed to know exactly when to show up at her door, when to walk past her house, when to make just enough noise in the yard next door to disrupt the silence. Karen, who now seemed determined to make Julia's life as uncomfortable as possible. It had started with the little things, the strange glances from across the fence, the casual comments about parking spaces and the shape of her garden. Then it escalated to knocking on her door under the guise of neighborly kindness, offering unsolicited advice on how to manage her house and garden. Julia had been polite at first, even indulging Karen's desire to talk about nothing and everything. But now, as Julia sat on her couch in the stillness of that rainy evening, the tension felt unbearable. She had finally come to the realization that Karen was not simply a lonely, overly attentive neighbor. She was something far more dangerous, and Julia was beginning to feel like a prisoner in her own home. It was then that she heard a sound, a knock on the door. Julia froze. It wasn't the usual knock, quick, light, and almost too polite to be real. This one was slow, deliberate, as if the person on the other side had all the time in the world. She stood up, the unease settling like a weight in her chest, and moved toward the door. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. There was no question who it was. Karen. Julia took a deep breath, steeling herself. She wasn't going to let this woman intimidate her any longer. She opened the door to find Karen standing there, a wide grin plastered on her face, her hands folded casually in front of her. There was something about the way she stood, too still, too composed, that set Julia's nerves on edge. "Hello, Julia," Karen said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt wrong. "I thought we could talk about the driveway." Julia blinked, momentarily taken aback. "What about it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could already hear the edge creeping in. Karen stepped forward, almost as if she were trying to push into the house. "Well, it seems like we have a little issue with where you park. I noticed you've been parking closer to my side of the fence, and it's making it difficult for me to get in and out of my driveway. You know, I'm sure you didn't mean to be inconsiderate, but it's been an ongoing problem." Julia's blood ran cold. The driveway? Was this really happening? She had parked there for months without a single complaint, and now Karen was making an issue out of nothing. But there was something about Karen's demeanor that Julia couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about parking. It was about control, about asserting dominance over her space, over her life. "I haven't been parking too close to your driveway," Julia said, her voice firm but laced with the tension she could no longer hide. "I've always parked in the same spot. If you have a problem with it, you could have just said something earlier." Karen's smile faltered, just for a moment. But then it returned, wider than before. "Oh, but I'm not the one with the problem, am I? It's just that it's been a little inconvenient for me. But don't worry, I'm sure we can work something out." Julia's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing much," Karen replied, her voice still that sickeningly sweet tone. "I just thought it might be easier for both of us if I moved your car for you next time. You know, just to save us both the hassle." Julia's heart skipped a beat. Move her car? Without permission? No. She wasn't going to let this woman take any more from her. She stepped forward, blocking the door with her body. "No, you don't have permission to move my car. And I don't need your help," Julia said, her voice now sharper, the anger finally breaking through the facade of politeness she had been maintaining. For a moment, Karen just stood there, the smile on her face twisting, no longer friendly but colder, more calculating. She stepped back, her posture stiffening, and Julia could feel the shift in the air between them. "I see," Karen said slowly, her voice now carrying a thinly veiled threat. "Well, Julia, if you insist on being difficult, I'm sure we'll have more conversations like this. It's a shame, really. I was just trying to help you settle in, but if you don't appreciate that—" Julia's pulse quickened. She knew this was just the beginning. She had seen the way Karen had been looking at her house, at her life. It wasn't about parking. It was about something far more sinister. Karen wasn't just trying to control the driveway, she was trying to control everything around Julia, her every move, her every decision. "I'll take care of it," Julia said coldly, shutting the door before Karen could say another word. Her heart was racing now, the realization hitting her with full force. The notes, the subtle threats, the constant surveillance, it was all part of Karen's plan. Julia wasn't just a neighbor to her, she was a target, and Karen would stop at nothing to break her down. The next day, Julia woke up with a strange, unsettled feeling gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the memory of the conversation with Karen, the smile that had never quite reached her eyes. As she sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee and trying to shake off the sense of impending danger, she heard it. A sharp, metallic sound. It came from the driveway. She rushed to the window, her heart thudding in her chest. What she saw made her stomach drop. Karen was standing next to her car, holding a hammer in her hand, a strange, intense look on her face. She wasn't just standing there. She was swinging the hammer at the windshield of Julia's car. Julia's first instinct was to call the police, but she hesitated. She had to act quickly, before Karen could do any more damage. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the scene, then dashed outside, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Karen!" Julia shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen looked up at her, the hammer still raised, her smile wide and unhinged. "I'm teaching you a lesson," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "You've been a problem for too long, Julia. I'm just showing you who's in control now." It was happening. Julia's worst fears were coming true. Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was a threat. And Julia had no choice but to act before things spiraled out of control completely. In that moment, as she stood frozen in shock, Julia realized one undeniable truth. She had underestimated Karen. And now she was going to have to find a way to fight back before Karen took everything from her. The sound of the hammer smashing against the windshield echoed in Julia's mind long after the moment passed. She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend what had just unfolded before her. The shards of glass glittered in the early morning light, a sharp reminder of the lengths Karen was willing to go to assert her control. Julia had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure, on being able to think her way out of any situation. But in that moment, all she could feel was a slow burning panic. The woman next door, the one who had once seemed so harmless, had turned into something far more dangerous. Julia's hand shook as she fumbled for her phone, snapping a photo of the scene, the evidence she needed to present to the authorities. As the camera clicked, Karen slowly lowered the hammer, her face twisted into an expression of satisfaction, as if she had just won a battle. The smile that stretched across Karen's face was so unnerving, so wide and empty that Julia could feel the weight of it bearing down on her. The realization was like a cold slap in the face. This was no longer just a dispute over parking or a few petty arguments about lawn care. This was something far worse. Karen was no longer content with simply being annoying. She was willing to escalate, to destroy, to push Julia to the brink. In a daze, Julia stepped forward, calling the police, her voice trembling as she explained what had just happened. "My neighbor, she just smashed my car window with a hammer," she stammered, feeling the absurdity of the situation in her words. "I need someone here now." The operator assured her that help was on the way, but even as she hung up the phone, Julia knew that this wasn't going to be a simple incident. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that would push her to her limits and beyond. She turned back to look at the damage. The car, now a mere shell of what it had been before Karen had attacked it. The damage was extensive. The windshield was shattered, and the side mirrors were bent out of shape. Julia had worked hard to afford that car. It was one of the few things in her life that had felt like a personal victory, a reward for her years of hard work, and now it was ruined, destroyed by the spiteful whims of the woman next door. Her anger flared, hot and sharp. How could Karen have done this? What had driven her to this point? Julia knew that Karen had always been a bit too nosy, a bit too eager to insert herself into her life. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just an overbearing neighbor. It was a woman with deep, unspoken resentment. Someone who believed that she had the right to dictate the terms of everyone's existence around her. And now she had crossed a line that Julia wasn't willing to let her walk back from. When the police finally arrived, Julia found herself standing next to the wrecked car, watching as the officers surveyed the damage. Their presence brought her a small measure of relief, but not much. They questioned her briefly, taking down her statement and then proceeding to talk to Karen, who, of course, denied everything. Julia could hear the calm, almost reassuring tone in Karen's voice as she spoke to the officers, her words dripping with false sincerity. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," Karen was saying. "It was just a little misunderstanding. I was just trying to get her attention. She parked too close to my driveway again, and I just lost my temper for a second." The officers didn't seem convinced, but they also didn't seem to take the situation as seriously as Julia thought they should. They gave her a sympathetic look and assured her that they'd file the report and investigate the incident further. They asked if she wanted to press charges, but Julia hesitated. Part of her wanted to throw herself into the legal system, to fight back with everything she had, but another part of her feared what would happen if she did. What if Karen retaliated even more? What if this turned into something far uglier than it already was? In the end, Julia agreed to file the charges, but the conversation left her feeling uneasy. She could see the doubt in the officers' eyes, the skepticism in the way they regarded the situation. Karen was playing the victim, and she was doing it well. It was clear that this was going to be a battle, not just of physical evidence, but of perception, of who could control the narrative. And Julia wasn't sure she had the strength to win that fight. The days that followed were a blur. Karen, as expected, became even more brazen, her behavior increasingly erratic. She would stand in her window, staring at Julia's house for hours at a time, her eyes never wavering. Sometimes Julia would catch glimpses of her out in the yard, just watching as if waiting for something to happen. The sense of being hunted, of being under constant surveillance, weighed heavily on Julia's mind. It was as if she was living in a world where she couldn't escape, where Karen's presence was a constant oppressive force that followed her wherever she went. Julia tried to go about her life as best as she could, but the damage had been done. Every time she walked outside, every time she got into her car, she felt the weight of Karen's eyes on her. She began to change her routine, avoiding the moments when she might run into Karen in the driveway or on the street. She stopped walking to the local cafe, started taking the long way around her neighborhood just to avoid having to pass Karen's house. But it wasn't enough. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, Karen was always there, lurking in the background, ready to strike again. The situation became more dangerous when Julia began receiving anonymous messages. At first, they seemed innocuous. Notes slipped under her door, small, cryptic reminders that someone was watching. "You can't escape," one note read. "You don't belong here." Julia had no idea where these messages were coming from, but they only served to fuel her paranoia. Were they from Karen? Or was someone else involved? Each note felt like a warning, a sign that things were escalating beyond her control. Julia was no longer content to wait and see what would happen next. She contacted a lawyer, explaining everything that had transpired, hoping for some sense of justice. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena, listened intently as Julia detailed the incidents, the damage, the constant threats. Elena took the case seriously from the beginning, which gave Julia some relief. For the first time in weeks, Julia felt like she had someone on her side, someone who would help her fight back. Elena advised her to gather more evidence, to document every encounter with Karen, every instance of harassment, every time Karen crossed the line. It was then that Julia realized just how much power Karen had over her life. Karen had wormed her way into every aspect of Julia's existence, from the parking spaces to the quiet moments in her own home. And Julia had been too polite, too passive, for too long. But now, with the support of Elena and the law on her side, Julia knew that it was time to fight back. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be painless, but she had no other choice. She couldn't let Karen destroy her life. The first step in her plan was to set up hidden cameras around her property, capturing everything Karen did, every glance, every act of intimidation, every time she crossed the boundary. Julia knew that the law would only be able to help her if she had solid proof, and she was determined to gather it. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about survival, about making sure that Karen's reign of terror came to an end before it could destroy her. But as Julia prepared for what would be the hardest battle of her life, she knew one thing for certain. Karen wasn't going to give up easily, and neither would she. As the days turned into weeks, Julia's resolve hardened like steel under pressure. The strange notes, the odd encounters, and Karen's increasingly bizarre behavior had pushed her into a corner. What had once been a battle over trivialities like parking spaces and garden maintenance was now a full-blown war for her peace of mind, her safety, and ultimately, her life. What she had thought would be a simple confrontation about boundaries had become something far darker, and Karen, once a harmless neighbor, had become an adversary who was not just hostile, but unhinged, unpredictable, and dangerous. Julia knew she had to take matters into her own hands. The police had come, yes, but they were too slow, too detached. They had listened to her, taken their notes, and left with promises of further investigation. But deep down, she knew that the wheels of justice would turn slowly, and in the meantime, Karen would continue to escalate her behavior. Julia had been passive for too long, and now she needed to be proactive. If Karen thought she could manipulate and control every aspect of her life, she was wrong. It was time to turn the tables. The first step in Julia's plan was to start documenting everything. She wasn't just talking about the obvious signs of harassment, Karen's blatant actions like smashing her car windows or the disturbing notes left on her doorstep, but the subtler tactics as well. The way Karen would stare at her from across the fence, the way she always seemed to appear at exactly the wrong time, watching her from her window. It was as if Karen had made it her mission to be a constant, invisible presence in Julia's life. Julia started carrying her phone at all times, recording video whenever she suspected Karen might be lurking nearby. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With Elena's help, she began to make sense of the patterns in Karen's behavior. The woman wasn't acting on impulse. She was calculating, strategic in her madness. She would wait for Julia to make the smallest mistake, like parking a few inches too close to her driveway, and then she would pounce. The hammer on the car wasn't an isolated incident. It was a warning, a demonstration of power, and a signal that Karen was willing to do whatever it took to keep Julia in her place. But as Julia analyzed Karen's actions, she started to notice something more troubling. Karen's aggression wasn't random. It was part of something bigger. There was a hidden motive behind all of this, one that Julia couldn't quite put her finger on. But it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. Every time Julia thought she had a handle on the situation, Karen would do something that made her question everything. A new note would appear, or Karen would show up at the house, making some strange remark about Julia's lack of respect. It was as if Karen was waiting for Julia to crack, to make one wrong move. And Julia realized that this was more than just a neighborly dispute. It was about control, manipulation, and a desire to break her down. The turning point came one Saturday morning when Julia was reviewing her video footage from the previous week. She had set up a few cameras around the perimeter of her property, hoping to capture some definitive evidence that would help her case. She was scanning through hours of mundane footage, catching glimpses of her own movements when something unusual caught her eye. Karen had appeared just as Julia suspected, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the shadow of Karen's house, was a man. Julia didn't recognize him at first. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He was wearing a black jacket, his hands in his pockets, and he stood there, watching the house. Julia's heart skipped a beat. This was no coincidence. She rewound the footage and watched again, more carefully this time. Karen had spoken to the man, gesturing toward Julia's house as if she were making a point, and the man had nodded, his eyes locked on the property. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. There was someone else involved, someone who had a stake in all of this. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Who was this man? And why was he involved in her nightmare? Was this some sort of accomplice, or worse, someone connected to Karen's history? Someone she had brought in to intimidate Julia further? The questions raced through her mind as she grabbed her phone and made a call to Elena. The lawyer picked up after a few rings. "Elena, I need your help. I've seen something. I don't know who this guy is, but he was standing in Karen's yard. He was watching my house. I'm not imagining things. This is serious." Elena listened quietly as Julia explained what she had seen on the footage, and after a brief pause, Elena spoke. "We need to find out who he is, Julia. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. If this guy is involved, we need to know everything about him. Start gathering more footage. If he's part of the harassment, we need to make sure we have him on record." Julia didn't need any more encouragement. This was the lead she had been waiting for. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. She had to know who this man was and what role he played in Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. He wasn't just a random person. He was connected to Karen's plans, and Julia needed to understand why. Over the next few days, Julia watched the footage again and again, hoping for more clues. She felt as if she were on the edge of something huge, something that could finally unravel the mystery that had been haunting her. Every time she saw the man on the screen, she felt a surge of anxiety, but also a sense of determination. She couldn't afford to let this slide. Not now, not when she was this close. It wasn't long before Elena made a breakthrough. She had managed to trace the man's identity through some legal channels and private investigator work. His name was Victor Lane, and he had a criminal history. He had been involved in several real estate fraud cases in the past, particularly in areas where wealthy properties were targeted for land grabs. It didn't take long for Julia to piece it together. Karen, despite her facade of being just a nosy neighbor, was connected to something much darker. Victor Lane was likely her partner in some sort of illicit scheme, and Julia was caught in the middle of it. Everything began to make sense now. Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate her for petty reasons. She was trying to push Julia out of the neighborhood, out of her property, so that she could make way for something bigger. Julia's home, her sanctuary, was at the center of a larger real estate scheme, one that involved manipulation, intimidation, and, quite possibly, illegal deals. Karen had been playing a long game, and Julia had only just discovered the first few moves. Julia sat in her living room, staring at the evidence, the realization settling over her like a heavy blanket. She was not just fighting for her home. She was fighting for her life, and if she didn't act quickly, Karen and Victor would take it all away from her. This wasn't just about being a good neighbor anymore. This was war. Julia had been too passive for too long, letting Karen walk all over her. But now it was time to fight back. She was done being the victim. She was done letting Karen win. The next move was hers, and she was going to make it count. With Elena on her side and the knowledge that Victor Lane was involved, Julia knew that it was time to escalate things further. The battle was no longer about petty neighborhood squabbles. It was about exposing the lies, the manipulation, and the dangerous games Karen had been playing from the start. And this time, Julia wasn't going to back down. She was going to take control of her life, her home, and her future, no matter what it took. The days after Julia's discovery about Victor Lane and his connection to Karen felt like a heavy fog had descended over her life. The weight of the knowledge, the realization that she had stumbled into something far bigger and darker than she could have ever imagined, sat heavily on her shoulders. She had hoped, for a brief moment, that once she knew who Victor was, once she had a name to attach to the looming threat, she could somehow find a way to outsmart them. But it wasn't that simple. The more she learned, the more complex the situation became, and the deeper she realized she was sinking into a world of corruption, manipulation, and deceit that she was not prepared to navigate. Karen had never been just an overbearing neighbor. She had been playing a long game, and now Julia had unknowingly become a pawn in that game. Victor Lane wasn't just a random man with a criminal past. He was a key figure in a network of real estate investors, and his connections spread far beyond the local community. He had ties to powerful people who controlled vast amounts of land, who operated in the shadows, manipulating markets and driving out anyone who stood in their way. The property Julia had inherited, the house that had once been her sanctuary, had become the target of these shadowy forces. And Karen, it seemed, had been carefully planted next door as a means of wearing Julia down, of driving her out, of getting her to sell before she could figure out what was truly at stake. Julia's initial shock had morphed into something far colder and more determined. She had no intention of leaving. She wasn't going to give up her home, her life, just because Karen and Victor had decided she was in the way of something bigger. They had underestimated her, and now, with the knowledge of what was really going on, Julia felt more resolved than ever to fight back. But the first step in this fight wasn't as simple as calling the police or hiring a lawyer to make a few threatening phone calls. No, this battle required strategy, patience, and, most importantly, a level of precision that Julia had never before thought necessary. It wasn't enough to simply know the enemy. She had to outsmart them, dismantle their plans piece by piece until they were left with nothing but their own lies and their own schemes to choke on. With Elena's help, Julia began to compile every piece of evidence she could find. The footage from the cameras, the notes from Karen, even the snippets of conversations she had overheard. She cataloged it all. Every little clue, every instance where Karen or Victor had overstepped, every sign that pointed to something darker than a simple feud between neighbors. Julia had to think like them, manipulative, calculating, and ruthless. She needed to anticipate their moves, to get ahead of them in ways they hadn't seen coming. That meant not just gathering evidence, but also watching and waiting, understanding the rhythm of their actions, and finding a way to expose them for what they were. The escalation began quietly. Julia knew that if she confronted Karen directly, if she attacked her head-on, it would only give Karen a reason to dig in her heels. Instead, she started to play a more subtle game. Every time Karen came by to complain, every time she made another subtle remark about parking or the state of the yard, Julia responded with an air of detachment, an indifference that began to frustrate Karen. Julia was no longer reacting with the same fear and frustration that had once made her a target. Now she was playing her own hand, responding with the calm of someone who had everything under control, even if on the inside she was constantly on edge. It wasn't about pushing Karen too far, not yet. It was about making her believe that Julia wasn't going to be easily manipulated, that she wasn't going to back down. But Karen, like a dog with a bone, wasn't going to be deterred by indifference. She began to up the ante. The notes grew more frequent, more pointed. "You're ruining this neighborhood," one of them read. "I'll make sure you regret not leaving when you had the chance." Another note, this one with a crude drawing of a house, had a simple message: "Sell. Or else." Julia's heart pounded every time she saw one of those notes, but she didn't flinch. She didn't react. Not outwardly. She knew that the more she showed fear, the more she showed weakness, the more Karen would tighten her grip. Then, just as Julia was beginning to think she could handle this, something happened that pushed the situation over the edge. She received an anonymous phone call late one evening, the voice on the other end low and distorted, as though trying to conceal its identity. At first, Julia thought it was just another prank, another one of Karen's petty games. But when the voice spoke, her blood ran cold. "I know what you've been doing, Julia," the voice said, its tone smooth but threatening. "You think you can play games with Karen, with Victor, but you're not going to get away with it. You'll regret it if you don't back off." Julia's mind raced as she stood frozen in the living room, holding the phone tightly to her ear. It was clear now that this wasn't just Karen's doing. Whoever was on the other end had access to information about her, about the investigation she'd been quietly running, about her plans to expose Karen and Victor. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, and it was a reminder that Julia was in over her head. But Julia wasn't going to back down. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no choice but to push forward. She had to take the next step. She had to expose them before they could destroy her completely. This wasn't just about preserving her home anymore. It was about survival. Elena had been telling Julia for weeks that she needed to go public with the information, to make sure that Karen and Victor knew that she was no longer a passive player in their twisted game. But Julia wasn't ready to make that move yet. Not until she had all the pieces in place. She needed more than just the shaky evidence she had. She needed something concrete, something that could be presented in court, something that would leave Karen and Victor with no way to spin the truth. So Julia began to dig deeper. She contacted more sources, reaching out to the local real estate agents, to people who might know more about Victor's business dealings. She started researching the property deals that had gone down in the area, looking for any connections that might tie Karen and Victor to larger illegal operations. She needed something that would not just expose them, but destroy them. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, just as Julia was beginning to feel like she had reached an impasse. She managed to obtain a set of financial records from one of Victor's associates, a document that detailed shady real estate transactions in the area. Transactions that Julia knew were directly tied to her property. As she skimmed through the pages, the weight of what she was reading sank in. The evidence was undeniable. Victor and Karen had been systematically purchasing properties in the neighborhood, and they were using illegal methods to force people out, either by threatening them, buying them out at a fraction of the price, or simply driving them out through harassment and intimidation. Julia's house was the last one on their list, and it was clear that they had been working for months, if not longer, to get her to sell. Julia's hands trembled as she held the documents in front of her. This was it. This was the proof she needed. With this, she could not only stop Karen and Victor, but also expose the network of corruption that had been poisoning her neighborhood. She wasn't going to be their victim anymore. She wasn't going to let them win. But the realization brought with it a new wave of fear. She couldn't stop now. The stakes had been raised, and she had already crossed a line. If Karen and Victor found out what she was planning, there would be no going back. They would retaliate, and Julia knew they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to silence her. The moment of truth was fast approaching. Julia had to decide if she was ready to risk everything, to go public, to expose them, and to take the fight directly to Karen and Victor, or if she was going to pull back and let them have their way. But deep down, Julia knew that there was no turning back now. The battle had already begun, and the only way out was through. The moment Julia had feared for so long was finally here. The decision to act, to step into the battlefield that had slowly consumed her life, no longer felt like a choice. It was survival. Karen and Victor had pushed her to the edge, and now there was no going back. Julia had gathered every ounce of courage and every scrap of evidence she could find, and she was ready to expose them for what they were: manipulators, liars, and criminals. She had no illusions about the danger she was walking into. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about standing up for her property anymore. This was about standing up for her dignity, her safety, and her very existence. They had been trying to strip all of that away from her, and now she would take it back, piece by piece. Her plan was risky, but she had no other option. The documents she had obtained, Victor's financial records, the shady deals, the evidence that showed just how deep the corruption ran, were her weapon. Elena had advised her to go public with everything, to present it all in court and let the legal system handle it. But Julia knew that wasn't enough. She had seen how quickly Karen and Victor had manipulated the authorities, how easily they had weaseled their way out of previous accusations. She couldn't afford to wait. She needed them exposed, publicly and immediately. The longer she waited, the more time they had to retaliate, to cover their tracks, to destroy her. The night before everything was to come to a head, Julia couldn't sleep. The house, once a symbol of safety and peace, now felt like a cage. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle outside her window made her jump. She kept thinking about the man she had seen in the footage. Victor Lane, the one who had loomed in the shadows watching her every move, a puppet master pulling the strings. She had no idea what kind of hold he had on Karen, what promises or threats had bound them together, but she knew one thing for certain. If she was going to make it through this, she would need to outsmart them. She had to be smarter than they were, quicker, and above all, unafraid. The next day, she met with Elena early in the morning. The lawyer had arranged for a press conference, something that made Julia's heart pound in her chest. She had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing her words, ensuring she had every detail locked down, every piece of evidence ready to be shown. But the reality of standing in front of the cameras, of putting her life in the hands of the public, made her nervous in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had always been a private person, someone who liked to keep her business to herself. Now, everything she had worked for was on the verge of being laid bare for the world to see. And with that exposure came the very real risk that Karen and Victor would retaliate. Elena could see the hesitation in Julia's eyes, but she pressed on, urging her to stay strong. "This is the moment we've been waiting for," Elena said, her voice steady. "You've done the hard part. Now it's time to show them who you really are. You're not just a victim anymore, Julia. You're a fighter, and this fight isn't just for you. It's for everyone else they've manipulated, everyone else they've hurt. You're not alone in this." Julia nodded, taking a deep breath. She couldn't afford to be afraid. If she wanted to take back control of her life, she had to do this for herself, for the people who had already been crushed by Karen and Victor's schemes. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore, she was fighting for justice. The press conference was set in motion. Elena had contacted several local news outlets, and by midday, cameras were set up outside Julia's house. Reporters, photographers, and even some curious neighbors had gathered, unsure of what to expect but sensing the gravity of the moment. Julia stood beside Elena, her heart thudding in her chest as the first questions were asked. She kept her composure, her voice unwavering as she recounted everything that had happened: the harassment, the threats, the manipulation, and the key piece of evidence: the financial records that tied Karen and Victor to a network of real estate fraud. She explained how they had been systematically buying up properties in the area, using deceitful and illegal tactics to force people out, and how her home had been one of their final targets. She laid it all out, piece by piece, with the evidence to back it up, showing the world exactly what they had tried to do to her. As the press conference went on, the weight of what Julia was doing began to sink in. She could feel the eyes of the public on her, but she no longer felt the crushing pressure of fear. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. She had already taken her power back in that moment. But she wasn't just telling her story. She was making sure that everyone in that crowd knew who Karen and Victor really were. She was making them listen. But as the reporters fired off questions, something unexpected happened. A familiar face appeared at the edge of the crowd. Karen. Julia's heart skipped a beat as she saw her neighbor standing just behind the cameras, her face twisted in a mask of disbelief. For a split second, their eyes met, and Julia could see the rage building behind Karen's eyes. Karen wasn't just angry. She was terrified. She knew that her game was up. She had underestimated Julia, had thought she could continue playing her manipulative games without consequences. But now, the entire world knew who she was. As Julia continued to speak, Karen suddenly pushed through the crowd, marching toward the front of the cameras, her face red with fury. "You're lying!" Karen screamed, her voice cracking with the weight of her panic. "This isn't true. You're making all of this up. You have no idea what you're talking about." For a moment, the crowd fell silent, the reporters unsure of how to react. Julia stood her ground, meeting Karen's frantic gaze with an unflinching stare. "You don't get to control this anymore, Karen," Julia said, her voice calm but firm. "You've lied to everyone around you for long enough. It's over." Karen's face contorted with rage, and for a brief moment Julia thought she might lunge at her, but instead, Karen spun on her heel and fled, disappearing into the crowd. Julia didn't have to chase her. The damage had been done. Karen had lost her power, and there was nothing left for her to do but retreat. As the press conference continued, Julia felt a surge of adrenaline. She had done it. She had exposed Karen and Victor for who they were, and now there was no way for them to weasel out of it. The media would pick up the story, and the public would demand answers. The wheels of justice would start to turn, and Karen and Victor would no longer have the luxury of hiding in the shadows. But even as the weight of victory settled on her shoulders, Julia knew this wasn't the end. There would be more battles to fight. Karen wouldn't give up easily, and Victor still had connections that could make this fight even more dangerous. But for the first time in weeks, Julia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had taken the first necessary step in reclaiming her life, and she wasn't going to stop until every last thread of their deceit was unraveled, until Karen and Victor could no longer hurt anyone else. This was her fight, and she was ready to see it through to the end. In the days following the press conference, the atmosphere around Julia's house seemed to shift. What had once been a place of tension, where every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of wind had felt like an omen of danger, now felt like a fragile refuge, a space that could finally be her own again. The storm of harassment, manipulation, and fear that had consumed her for so long was beginning to recede. But Julia knew it wasn't truly over. There were still loose ends to tie up, still battles to be fought, but the most significant victory had already been won. She had exposed the truth. Karen and Victor's carefully constructed world of lies and deceit had been torn apart, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. The media had picked up the story immediately, and within hours of the press conference, news outlets were reporting on the real estate fraud ring that had been operating right under the community's nose. Julia's story became the focal point of every article, and as the details of Karen's involvement emerged, the public outcry was deafening. It turned out that Karen wasn't just a rogue neighbor. She had been part of a larger conspiracy with Victor, who had a long history of using coercion and manipulation to acquire valuable properties. Their entire operation had been predicated on intimidation, fraud, and a network of willing but unscrupulous individuals who worked behind the scenes to force people out of their homes. What Julia had suspected all along was now in full view for the world to see. The documents she had presented, the footage she had captured, and the testimony she had given were all solid evidence that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, Julia felt a sense of justice settling over her. She had done what she set out to do. She had fought back when every instinct told her to retreat, when it seemed easier to just give in to the pressure and leave the neighborhood behind. But she hadn't. And now, as the press continued to expose the full extent of Karen and Victor's crimes, Julia felt the weight of what she had accomplished. She had not only saved her home, but she had also taken down a criminal enterprise that had been operating right under the noses of the people who should have been protecting the community. For the first time in a long while, Julia felt like she could breathe again. But the satisfaction of exposing the truth came with its own set of challenges. The public outcry was intense, and it wasn't just aimed at Karen and Victor. Julia found herself thrust into the spotlight, a place she had never sought out. Interviews, questions, and requests for comment flooded in from all sides. She had become a symbol, a representation of what it meant to stand up to corruption, to fight back against the powers that be. At first, she wasn't sure how to handle it. She had never been someone who enjoyed attention, who sought to be the center of it all. But as the days wore on, she realized that this was the price she would have to pay for her decision to fight back. People needed to know what had happened, and if her story could help inspire others to stand up for themselves, then she would do whatever it took to be that voice. Still, there was a lingering sense of unease, a constant awareness that this was not a simple victory. Julia knew that Karen and Victor wouldn't just fade into the background. Their power, their influence had been exposed, but they weren't defeated yet. The legal process would take time, and in the meantime, Karen, furious and humiliated, was bound to retaliate. It was only a matter of time before she came after Julia in some other way. That was something Julia couldn't ignore. She couldn't let her guard down, not yet. Days after the press conference, Julia's fears were realized. Karen, having been publicly outed, had gone into hiding, avoiding the media and the authorities. But Julia knew that this wouldn't stop her. She had already shown how far she was willing to go to destroy someone's life, and now that the world knew the truth, she had no reason to play by the rules. It wasn't long before Julia received another ominous note. It was slipped under her door late at night, just as the others had been. This one, however, was different. It wasn't just a cryptic message or a threat. It was a detailed plan, one that promised consequences if Julia didn't back off. It said, "You think you've won. You think you're safe. But you've only made things worse for yourself. I'll make sure you regret this. You'll never be able to escape what's coming." The handwriting was familiar, unmistakably Karen's. The note was a reminder that the fight was far from over. Julia was shaken, but she refused to be intimidated. She wasn't the same person who had first moved into this house, uncertain and unsure of how to deal with Karen's bizarre behavior. She was stronger now, wiser. She knew how to protect herself, how to fight back. She immediately contacted Elena, who helped her file for a restraining order against Karen. They also worked with the police to ensure that the authorities were aware of the ongoing threats and that there would be no further attempts at intimidation. But Julia also knew that Karen's legal troubles were just beginning. The investigation into the real estate fraud ring continued to grow, and Karen's involvement had not gone unnoticed by the authorities. The press had continued to cover the story, and soon Karen's criminal actions were under intense scrutiny. It wasn't long before Karen was arrested. The charges piled up: fraud, harassment, intimidation, and conspiracy. And Victor, who had always remained in the background, was also taken into custody as the authorities connected him to the larger network of real estate fraudsters operating in the area. The investigation revealed that Karen and Victor had been involved in a series of illegal land deals, using threats and underhanded tactics to force people out of their homes and businesses. Their manipulation of the market had been so systematic that it took authorities months to untangle the full scope of their crimes. But with Julia's testimony and the evidence she had provided, the case against them was airtight. Julia didn't revel in their downfall. She didn't take any pleasure in knowing that their world had come crashing down around them. But there was a sense of finality, a sense of justice being served. She had stood her ground, and it had made all the difference. The neighborhood, once under the shadow of Karen and Victor's influence, began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The community that had once been afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge the power Karen and Victor wielded, slowly began to rebuild itself. People reached out to Julia, expressing their gratitude and admiration for the stand she had taken. They had witnessed her courage, and it had given them the strength to stand up for themselves as well. In the aftermath of the arrests, Julia found herself at a crossroads. Her life had changed in ways she had never expected. She had faced her worst fears, had fought back against the forces trying to take everything from her, and in the process, had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had taken control of her life, her home, and her future. And though the scars of this battle would remain with her, she knew that she had emerged from it stronger than ever. As she stood on the porch of her home one evening, looking out at the quiet street, Julia realized that the peace she had been searching for all along wasn't something that could be handed to her. It was something she had to fight for, something she had to earn. And now, with Karen and Victor gone, she could finally take the time to rebuild, to make her home truly hers. The battle was over, but Julia's journey was just beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. The future was hers to create, and she was no longer afraid.